Hello and welcome to the Broken Rail's 1192nd New Social Environment. I'm Min, a Programs Associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Vian Sora and Andrew Woolbright. And now I'll introduce today's guest and host. Vian Sora is an Iraqi contemporary painter whose atmospheric work embraces decay, turmoil, and the dynamics of change enmeshed with cultural and historical references. Growth and the bonds between civilizations and nature are central themes in her work as Sora seeks to break borders, often challenging the fixity of the figure-ground relationship, along with restrictions on subject matter. And our host today, artist, curator, and critic Andrew Woolbright, is based in Brooklyn, New York, and is an MFA graduate from RISD in painting. Woolbright is the founder and director of the gallery Below Grand, located on the Lower East Side in New York. In addition to curating, he is an editor-at-large at the Brooklyn Rail. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Andrew, to get us started.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today, as always, on this wonderful afternoon here in New York. Vian, I'm so excited to get to talk to you about this show. For those of you who haven't had a chance to go see it, it's a must-see in person. It's incredibly sensuous. The surfaces, which we're going to talk about, are difficult to see in images, but they are stunning images as well. But Vian, I've been looking forward to this conversation all week, and how you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you, Andrew. And thank you, Brooklyn Rail, for having me. It's a true pleasure and honor. And of
Absolutely.
course, thanks everyone who logged in their busy day.
Yeah. Well, let's jump right into it because I have a lot. But Vian, in past conversations and writing about your work, the idea of the border has come up both as a motif, but also as a literal formal event. And I just want to ask you, first off, where does that concept of the border originate from? And how do you, I'm interested in, like, as a painter, how you balance something that is both a formal, literal thing and also, like I said, a motif or an idea of like working through the process.
Thank you. It's actually a great question to start from. And I think that moment for me, the moment of border started just from, my background as my parents, as a Kurdish, my dad is Kurdish, my mom is Arabic. I was aware of these differences from the moment I was born, but also thinking of borders as a restriction for things that took place in my life, as a on my path to of migration here, as also borders as possibilities. So I always was fascinated by the idea of breaking those borders and bringing things back again. But then in the later years, as of 2015, I thought of breaking the bodily borders and thinking of certain fragments if it exists in a realm that not natural to it. So I started playing with all these metaphors that led into these exhibitions recently.
Could we talk about what some of those metaphors are? I mean, we'll get to it at some point in the conversation, but I want to follow up on that.
Yeah, definitely. So, for example, like most of these works where they start, and for me, the first form of breaking those borders, most of these works start from a calligraphic moment
Mm.
where I start randomly with writing something in Arabic or in Kurdish. And from there, these moments become more abstract, and I start breaking the Arabic letters just to represent the loss of culture and language, represent how I am assimilating in a new country. And although I've been living here for 15 years, but I just noticed even how my handwriting is changing when I write Arabic or English. So that becomes like the first kind of moment of breaking those borders with the first mark making. And then these forms and these fonts take shape of a figure, which most people or viewers associate the work being abstract, but all these works will have a figure in the background. And it started from writing, which is a tradition in Arabic language, calligraphy, especially in the Kufic style of writing, is to turn letters into bodies, into people. So that's kind of the first moment I use that kind of term into breaking those borders of language, of letters, of body into something new. And it kind of, it's more evident with the painting on the right. And, because you do see a body, you do see kind of format of birds and humans, but also that painting was a reaction, a direct reaction to the fires in LA that kind of triggered the moment of seeing palm trees burning in Iraq as an effect of bombing. So these two moments came together in one work and it led into this.
There's so much already to unpack. I think it's so interesting to think of your starting point as language. I mean, it makes total sense with borders and language being this first border that we have of like creating multiple audiences, those that understand and those who don't. I love the way you title your works, and at times there's a kind of mythological bent, or like I want to be careful here, an interest in a type of spiritualism or transcendence through material. What's the language that you start with in the painting? Like when you're using this word, is it a casual language or casual words that you're fragmenting, or is it more spiritual, enigmatic texts?
It's actually both, if I could do that, because they're both, there are spiritual moments. It's the first thing that comes to your brain, but also there are references of certain words that I'm thinking about or a certain poem. And the last 5 years specifically, those words are direct kind of metaphor of what's happening, whether in my day or politically or in my world or the country. So, and I never share what it is because that for me is something between me and the work. And I'm always interested to allow the viewers to, perceive it in their own way. But also I do use some of these kind of, initial moments to lead you that there is a language here, there is a word. I am a person who is detaching from a place, but also not fully belonging here yet. And it is always, I think most artists deal with that. But in my life, I experienced this firsthand as someone who was born to a Kurdish father, but never learned the language 100%. Actually, I started speaking Arabic and English when I was younger in Baghdad. Those were the first two languages I learned. So there's always that sense of loss of connection with the Kurdish language. And so it's like those two things come immediately to my mind when I'm writing in Arabic, trying to mimic a moment of a language that I can't speak, which is Kurdish. So I don't know if that makes any sense, but that's how I'm thinking about it.
Well, that first kind of initial introduction to the understanding of a loss of language, was that is an aesthetic experience to you then? Or what was your first aesthetic experience as a child that you were drawn to that maybe still affects your work today?
I could think of many aesthetic moments, especially as a child in Baghdad. And of course, probably the most tacky one would be the most aesthetic thing that I experienced firsthand was being in a garden at my grandparents' house. But the the aesthetic effect on me of the monuments in Baghdad as a child who was driven in a car, and you just look up and see these immense monuments that you don't know what they are, why they're there, what is the historic and political context that brought these massive structures there. So like one of the examples, obviously the Freedom Monument by Jawad Salim, which is still standing until this day. The Martyr Monument, that is probably everybody saw it as from a very famous news coverage in CNN. It's the two blue split domes. And these monuments were built as I was growing older in Iraq because under the dictatorship of Saddam Hussein, there was this emphasis on trying to show that power through building these monuments. So they were probably built for some really let's say evil purposes, but they were what I was growing around. I grew up around these monuments. So later I met some of these artists who created those monuments, and I was obviously very kind of, either repelled or intrigued by some of these. So these were just to a direct answer that those were the first aesthetic experiences. But then, later when I was a little bit older, my parents took us to Greece for the first time. And I had like my first art history moments with all the sculptures and the art that I was exposed to. So I think those will be the most defining moments for me.
Well, it's just so interesting because I found and find your paintings so sensuous. They're so rewarding to look at, and there's such a generosity to them. And it's so interesting to hear you talk about how many of the first steps are starting with steps that you are uncertain of, or places of, in some cases, direct pain, or the uncertainty of like being attracted to something but not knowing if you should be, like these monuments, or language, which creates difference. And I'm wondering, like, when you work with that place of not knowing and then kind of build the painting, is that a restorative process to you, or do you feel like you know the thing better, or is it a not knowing that you're after?
I recently started approaching, I mean, the direct answer would be, of course, I know what I'm after, and always in the beginning of the work. And of course, there are these moments of surprise that most artists are interested more into it. But when I am during like the first very fast pace of the process, and then I start slowing everything down to just basically learn from the work. And I like to experience something while I'm working, which is like if you're swimming and you're barely touching your feet in the ground, I mean, in the bottom of the sea or the bottom of the river. And I love that moment where, like, I love to elongate that moment where I'm kind of lost. I know that I'm approaching something with the work, but I'm yet not really standing on something. And I'd like to leave the viewer with that feeling as well, because I feel that ambiguous kind of aspect is more interesting than just giving you an answer. So that's the pace. Like it starts where I am solid about an idea, about the pigments, about the colors, and then there is a lot of kind of this push and pull with the unknown, and then leaving right before it's completing the work right before it's 100% done in my head.
So interesting. I mean, what about how do you feel about like the language of like erotics? Because I mean, like that in-betweenness of not knowing how something will conclude. Is it comfortable to say that's a type of almost like political or cultural erotic of like, um, yeah, luxuriating in that space that so many people are afraid to have, which is like wanting finality, and you're trying to like explore the sensuousness in that.
Yes, I think that really applies to my work. And
Hmm.
in the latest years also, I really lost interest in giving answers or, just making this aboutness. I am not interested in that. Because I feel like, I mean, it's an ongoing discovery, and it's a very present work. There is a lot of historical context in the background. There's a lot of personal narrative, but also it's a work that is dealing with now. And I use all the foundation that I have into depicting that, which I don't know if I just answered your question or I went to a different subject, but it just triggered me thinking about that ongoing quest for just keeping the work somehow ambiguous while it's having a million layer maybe. But yeah, I mean, that's how I'm thinking about it.
I mean, going off of that, I have the question, the work is so dynamic. There's such a range to it, and I'm wondering how you think about like consistency. Like you said, there's this kind of like like not competitive, that's so capitalist, but like a daringness to want to do something new or surprising yourself in each painting. But when I look at the work, there are kind of recurring things that come in, that's not pure chaos in every one. I'm wondering how you think about like consistency. Like for me, looking at your work, like the color blue really is like something that like I want to know more about and talk about. It's like something that um, keeps coming back in a way of like there's a trust between you and that color, or maybe it's a symbolic thing, or maybe it's something that you associate very strongly with a moment in time. But how do you first, before we get into the color blue and how you think about color, how do you think about like consistency versus like really trying to start and surprise yourself?
This is a great question that I don't know how to answer 100% because you just made me think about it in a different way. And I love that because in the, there are always new things happening during like the start of a series of works. I never work on one painting unless if it's towards the end. And when I start, I'm always thinking about consistency, especially in the latest years, when I entered the gallery realms, let's see. And I think about it in terms of approaching something closer and pulling, like away from it, especially with this exhibition with Sky from Below, because and I'll get back to the blue because it's connected. And it's like, flipping the pages of one book. And this is how I'm thinking about consistency after this question is that flipping the pages of one book where maybe each page has something different from the next page, but it is within the same book. It is, revisiting ideas and thoughts and situations based on whatever day I'm creating that work in the studio. And sometimes I intentionally start connecting the dots on certain works and they become, in a dialogue, they start talking to each painting, talk to the next painting because they're happening at the same time. So that's how I'm thinking about consistency, if that applies to it.
Yeah.
In terms of the color blue, it's interesting you say that I establish a certain trust because it's a color that I connected through during my childhood in Baghdad, where there is a lot of blue in the domes, not only in the mosques, because Baghdad, when I grew up under the dictatorship, it wasn't a religious place. It's religion was used later to control certain things, but it was a place of that gave homage to architecture, whether it's ancient architecture or modern. What many people are not aware of Baghdad history with mid-century modern and like Le Corbusier influence, and the architects who wanted to skip and just work with cleaner lines and modern kind of creations. So blue was everywhere. It was like blue and ochre, which is exactly what you see at the painting Sabil 2 here. And that color later became kind of my relationship with the world. I moved 4 countries within 5 years on my way to escape Iraq in 2006. And it became how it's basically the most thing you're going to see when you're flying over a place. You're going to see water, you see the sky, and it became the connector of that ever-changing landscape that I experience. So it's a color that deals with the topography of how I arrive to a place, how I see places, and then it's the color that kind of define these places for me. So I always, you'll see me in some paintings escaping blue, but I go back to it in some way. And I also had the obsession with the history of blue and lapis lazuli and how ultramarine blue was basically extracted from that color. And a lot of male artists in the 18th and 19th century resisted working with it, but then it became the thing to work with. So maybe that answers some of these questions about blue, but I can talk about blue for the next hour. So,
Me too. I mean, no, it's gorgeous. I love how you spoke about it because I also think about just the formal elasticity of blue. Like I always think about Carolee Schneemann talking about how blue is the most mobile color, that it can shift to violet so easily and green so easily. And on a painter's palette, blue has such a range and it's like so generous, whereas like other colors may be more forgiving and more bracketed in that way. But the other question, and this is like a great slide for it I have, is how you're thinking about like kind of these different zones that you create at times, where it's like there's a division, and is that a type of bordering where you have maybe like a figure or a space on the right, a distinct figure or space on the left, and they seem like they're maybe of different worlds. And this, in the painting on the left, you've got this really beautiful crimson lavender color versus like that blue. How are you thinking about that? Is it a dialectical opposition, or is it like a type of more of that border and difference thing?
It is both. But the painting on the left is actually there is a very specific thing happening. It's titled Dual Realms, and it was the first painting that I started for Sky from Below. And I was thinking about the concept of being on two different, like how my body is always in two different time zones, which many people who are not born in the US maybe experience. And how I always think in those terms is like my body is here, but somehow within me I am on like a different time zone somewhere in West Asia. And I tried to do this like it was an experiment somehow. It was a very difficult painting to approach because I was trying to create that clash between two places, like that moment of separating the sea and be on those two different time zones. So it brought a lot of memory there. It's not obvious in this, like it's very difficult to look at that painting in a picture because it has so much, and I want it to be an immersive situation, but it has kind of fragments from my grandmother dress, the traditional Kurdish dress on the right side in the pink, and then it has fragments from where I live right now in Kentucky, where it's completely opposite of my background. But because this whole show was triggered by a trip that I recently did to attend my show at the Third Line in Dubai, and we just flew over Iraq for the first time, and I haven't been to Iraq or over Iraq in 18 years, and basically just dealing with these emotions of flying over your country for the first time, but you still don't feel safe enough to go there, and seeing how that landscape is changing and how some of these places that I recognized before, they look completely the opposite, which answers hopefully your question is that's how these shapes and forms was formulated in both kind of paintings. The painting on the right called Enki's Reeds, and Enki is like the god Enki who started, the mythology, the Sumerian mythology, and just thinking about flying over the marshes of Iraq, which is a region that was heavily bombed even by Saddam Hussein, and it changed the shape of that marshes area where it used to be a fertile ground for migrating birds and for the Arabs of the marshes. So I started just creating this opposite kind of color of what I saw. I mean, it's driven from this very similar pigments, but I exaggerated the color to demand space and presence. So yeah, I mean, that's the basic idea behind how these forms were created, to answer your question.
Well, going off of Inky's reads, I mean, can you talk a little bit more about that kind of mythological time or that time outside of time or thinking about like maybe ancestral time in terms of like not to play too much like kitchen sink psychologist, but like I'm wondering if like is that like trying to get to a time of culture outside of Saddam Hussein, or is that like trying to create a bigger kind of umbrella for like a community or a culture that you want to know about, or is it a transcendent thing, or all of the above?
It's all the above, but I'll add to that. For me, I'm always kind of dealing with this polarization of everything around me, but also trying, like, I find it a way a lot of viewers and people who are not familiar with my background or don't know me personally want to associate with me through my Iraqiness, which is great, and it's the background. But also, I'm trying to talk about this in a kind of context bigger and wider than anyone familiar with in terms of Iraq and Mesopotamia, because that's the name of it. I mean, that region is so rich, not to be defined in one way, the political way that everybody know it. So yes, it is a way for me to throw all these narratives out of the door and just give some homage or context into more ancient times. These ancient times also were brutal, but also again, like some of that history started before ancient Egypt. It started maybe 7,000 years ago. And we're keeping learning from these, histories, but also what I kind of faced during my life. I mean, I lived there for 3 decades. That history always repeats itself. And somehow I try to go back to these references that kind of will give you an idea about maybe a more unknown time, but it's a time outside of politics and religion and what everybody tried to associate it with. So I guess it's like a second nature that I default to when I use some of these references, because most of the events that take place that lead to the creation of these works are events that happening maybe here in the US or, but also I am, in terms of going back to the concept of breaking borders, is that, that the dialogue around, people from that region, or the whole dialogue of separating people is very dangerous in my mind, because myself and my family suffered from it on a firsthand. And, anyone can come to you and, put you on a trial for something that you have nothing to do with, or just because you belong to a certain group. So this is something I try to break or, defy within the work itself.
Well, I mean, I just love where you arrive at with all that in mind, which I think that's like this, for me, it feels like this interesting kind of cosmology, or like the point of origination, to kind of try to understand, like, where was the first wound, or where is the first kind of violence, or where is the first thing? And then what if we can maybe reimagine it as a sensuousness or a beauty, or can we take that chaotic beginning and can we see a creation myth? And like, what is it like? It feels forensic in a really interesting way to go back to that deep register scale of time, or have that in your mind as you begin these paintings. But then the follow-up question I have with that is, how much of this is actively in your mind as you're painting? Like, you have this really great cultural research, and it's obviously an embodied presence, but when you're painting, are you thinking about these calligraphic words and this culture that you're carrying, or is it really just a relationship to the hand and the body?
It's nowadays it's more of the relationship to my body, but also it's within me. It's this whole context is within me, but also I'm very aware of what's happening on daily basis around me, and especially where I live, which is by design. I enjoy living here because also it is a place of clash as well, in terms of where it is in the US and what is the background of the region I'm living within, and for now, because also it allow me to reflect on a lot of the history here in the US and how there's a lot of similarity to, I mean, whether we like it or not, or we understand it or we not, there is like brutality into the history here that happened in Iraq as well and happening in that side of the world. And it is always boiling within me. And that anxiety is a healthy anxiety for the work. Versus if I live on a perfect place on a beach, I probably will not create these works in the same tension and the color drama that it's demanding. But yeah, I mean, it's like the background, my historical background, again, I don't always want to reference the trauma, but it's there. It's clearly how you see it. And when you see these works in person, you feel that energy, that explosive energy that always was around me. I mean, in a literal way, I lived a lot around explosions, especially between 2003 and 2006 when I worked with the Associated Press. But I also tried to reverse that into a bigger picture, because within the early years of developing this style, I always resisted the idea of becoming a number in the news, like a lot of my colleagues became number in the news, especially in these years after 2003. So I resisted the idea of being a victim. I resisted the idea of creating something that is expected from me. as a female painter from that side of the world specifically.
Yeah.
So I decided to go bigger and more demanding, but also it's a second nature. It's sometimes things are planned, but also I go the opposite of the plan, and it's more rewarding in terms of results.
Well, and I would love to shift the conversation. I mean, it's all wonderful, but I have so many painterly questions to ask you too, of just getting into like the process of these things. And I think I'm in the right room and saying this to the right person, but I've told people before, I'm deeply suspicious of paintings that at some point don't take place on the floor. Like I think gravity is such an important dimension to making a painting and letting things drip and spill and letting turpentine or medium kind of split things apart. But can we talk about like the beginning stages of each painting, like that maybe chaotic moment, or maybe you don't see it as chaotic, where you're letting the material kind of producing from its own movement and then reacting to it?
Well, most of the paintings start from that calligraphic moment of
Mhm.
sketching these very rapid, primitive, early sketches on the canvas, but also on the like paper, small paper, and there will be hundreds of them laying around. And I sometimes forget why I did these drawings, but they start there, and sometimes they start from like, a moment of spray paint that I intentionally keep, as a kind of a first mark making moment where I can't even erase it or mess with it. So it will guide other things. So then the painting go flat, and that's when there is this rapid application of pigments that I take some time to mix, because I'm interested also how these colors work or repel from each other. So these are these moments initially that happen in the early stages of the work. And yes, it is flat, but then I manipulate it with my body weight, with my breath, with any tool sometimes around me. But I am obsessed with the idea of preserving the work and creating a texture that lasts for a very long time, because I watched how a lot of these monuments and artworks that I referenced earlier in this conversation, I watched how these aged or destroyed by bombing or were lost. So I'm obsessed with the idea of adding and stripping and then adding color to the areas that was stripped to create new possibilities and to create that power dynamic within the work. Like it's what you think is going to be dominating is going to probably be repelled or power shifted to something else. So you see that with this work too. After about a month or two, and sometimes three, of doing that process of adding and stripping in many, many layers of work, that's when the painting go on an easel or on the wall. And that's when the controls start. That's when the brushwork start and the oils. And that's when these forms and relationships start. So the process go from rapid, erratic, chaotic into slowly control in terms of, an obsession of perfection. And I'm asked about whether these are stencils or not. They're never stencil. I don't even know how to stencil. But I'm obsessed with the brushwork, with the idea of holding a brush and creating scenes by your hand that has a completely different demeanor in terms of result if you're just doing something technical. So that illustrates the process. To create these solids areas that transcend into darker or lighter backgrounds, it requires an average of 40 to 60 layers of oil and slow drying kind of process. That is kind of it's a reflection to basically, I think I learned that through learning something very hard to my nature, which is patience. I'm not a patient person by nature, but I was humbled and learned how to learn. And through this process, it was something that I started intentionally applying linseed oils to slowly kind of, dry these backgrounds, which in the end, I mean, the whole idea for me is that me and David Nolan talk about this all the time, is that we we want to slow the viewers to and how they look at these paintings, because it's not a painting that's going to give you an answer. It's not a picture. It's just something you experience, you feel, whether you are connected to it or repelled by it. That means I'm successful in getting a reaction from you. But if you're just passing it like this, then you didn't get the work. So that kind of is the summary of what's going on process-wise.
That makes total sense. Oh, I mean, if we go back like 2 slides, I think to that, yeah. I mean, it's so interesting that, I mean, there's a very literal interpretation of your work, but I mean, the spatial optical sensation you create by making what could be the underpainting, like the deep space of a painting, making that the positive form and painting the negative space last, like it does kind of give form to what is absent in this really interesting illusionistic way, where like the like your eye senses what is supposed to retreat because there's gravity to it and there's erasure to it and there's deep kind of removals and layers. But then with that heavy border, it becomes object-like at the same time in some ways, or it folds up or becomes like a low relief. And it's just a really interesting formal device to kind of, I don't know if it's like stepping into the absence of history or the absence of culture, the absence of memory or material memory, but to give presence, like you said, to void is something you do phenomenally well.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I'm also thinking about these works in terms of future. Like a lot of these works for me, they're futuristic scenes in my mind, you know, how I think about future, how I think about translating something, like you said, from historical kind of context, but also, you know, the consciousness that is shared with so many others. But also I think about it, if these, in the future, there are these moments where you're creating from so many segments into something, like specifically in this painting, because there is actually a form of a woman, but also it goes into many other layers, but I'm not going to give it out here, because then everybody will want to see the figure as usual.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I love, thank you for bringing that up because I think that concept of futurity is so important for understanding. And I have questions about that, or not the luxury, but the political significance of imagining a future not being obligated to or held up in the past, or like even temperance of being present. But then it's like the next step of like, we have to imagine what the future looks like. We have to give ourselves that space to do it. And I'm wondering like how that feels to you. That can be an exhausting process to always have to be an architect of the future. Or is it more liberating to kind of think in that term?
It is both. It's imagining a place of possibilities that never happened, maybe, but also I do think, you know, if you tell me 15 years ago that AI is going to be like it is now, because I will tell you there is no way, because many people don't know that my first degree was computer engineering, and I joined the first program in Baghdad that had only 4 women and about 250 men, that was dealing with artificial intelligence, and it was studied and discussed as a possibility that will never happen, maybe in 1,000 years. And now we're living this. We're using AI. We can agree or disagree with it, but it's happening. So we are living some aspects of this future, but also in terms of not repeating mistakes, or, you know, falling under certain, like the prejudice against certain groups of people, or, you know, not appreciating the differences. This is what I fight against. This is what I always wanted to avoid. And this is why also, I mean, in my country, I mean, my home country, it was manifested in a horrible way, is how like people couldn't accept each other, or of course it was influenced by foreign politics. But then when you see the clash of society and you see what happened, and I live the effect of it every day, because I still have immigrant family that are not allowed to stay in this country, for example. So even if you have this forgiveness and you have this openness about the world might not share this with you. So in terms of answering this question, is the future I think about and I want to kind of manifest is that acceptance and that kind of understanding that people are people in the end. And this is, I think that's the core of my work. In a cheesy way, I will say that. That's what I try to kind of show in the work, within the work.
Well, I wonder, and this is kind of a theory that as painters, especially, but as artists, we can never hide ourselves from the work. I wonder how you feel about maybe an interpretation of your work going off of this background in computer engineering of like kind of humanizing data or like seeing data as an embodied knowledge, like especially talking about like 40 to 50 layers of oil paint and the need to like put all these materials that sometimes don't get seen in the final layers or aren't apparent. Is that like a form of like embodied human storage on some level? That's so interesting.
It is actually, thank you for asking that. It is because also it becomes a sport in the end, if I may say that. In the end, it becomes a kind of a power play between the artist, me in this case, and the material. Because I know if I use very high level pigments and I apply it in a certain way and I distress it, then apply again, that's the result. But also in terms of translating to a background of a mathematical background, because also I'm interested in mathematics and architecture, but also I'm interested in sculpture. So by repeating many, many layers and each layer might have a different scenario. You are mimicking a moment that happens in C language, for example, and that's a very primitive language we studied in computer science, but also it follows art history moments and it follows like how, for example, Vasari, that's the first techniques actually learned were from his books where he was basically given homage and a spot to other artists. And the process that Da Vinci started when he started the each canvas or each mural with a thin layer of acrylic and kept multiplying it, then the oil happened, and that's how you create that very solid enmeshed situation. And that's what I follow. But I also studied why ancient Mesopotamians used more vivid colors versus Egyptians, but it didn't last. So I was obsessed on why that didn't happen. So I started, that's what this process also follows. So a complicated maybe answer to your question, but it's
But what's the answer to that question? Why didn't they last?
because there was more humidity in these cities were all built. The first cities in Iraq and Mesopotamia were built by the rivers, obviously Euphrates and the Tigris. And that region 7,000 years ago and 10,000 years ago, even 50 years ago, used to be more lush and there was more water in the air, versus now it's dealing with desertation because of the many wars and bombing, but also climate change. Egypt is drier, but also there were components that was used. There were certain glow that was created, extracted from bugs that was in Africa that didn't exist in Asia. I mean, in West Asia, which is where Mesopotamia is. So it's all these factors. But now I am presented with, I'm spoiled and artists are spoiled. We can get anything online. Like you can have not the same pigments, but pigments that followed these kind of ways. But it was packaged to us in as a final kind of destination, and it's archived. So yeah, I mean, but on my path of trying to understand all these things, I learned hundreds of other things about paint and color, and it became a sport for me to what am I going to use that is going to evoke these emotions? What color I'm going to create that is maybe very loud for certain people, but for me, it's a color that demand your kind of attention.
Well, I mean, attention is, obviously something in going back to your talks with David Nolan, attention is a type of criteria that I think painting has to fight for, and it's something that we do. But going off of that, I wonder if there are any other criteria or rules that you follow within your painting, or how you know it's, there's the cliche question, but it's worth asking every time, how you know when it's finished. But I'm interested in a painter like you who has so many moves. What are your rules, or what is it that you won't do, or what feels inauthentic to yourself in a painting, or how do you know there's a completeness to it?
I mean, to answer from the end, I finish the painting when it stops really bothering me. But at this point, for my technique, for what I am known for, it requires a certain kind of a luxurious finish to the oils that it's sealed. Every color is served. But of course, sometimes I see works after, like there are a few works that are currently in certain museums that I saw and they look even better, or they look like they could have used something. I can't say which ones, but there are certain works that I always think that, oh, I could have done this or that. But the moment of completion, I ideally would love to leave the work for a month or two before sending it out to the world and let it just breathe. But there is a certain finish that I require for myself to know that it's kind of done. But also, I'd like to keep that tension between myself and the painting, and eventually between the viewer and the painting. I don't like it to be just this perfect kind of insert or something. In terms of rules, I come from a lot of rules because also I was, taught firsthand from some great pioneer Iraqi artists, where because of my family background and being around these artists, I learned how to sit by someone for hours and not to say a word. And I was a child. I needed to go to the bathroom and I wouldn't even dare to say I need to go to the bathroom. And how to notice these rules that was created by this artist for other artists, or like that moment of breadcrumbs from artist to artist, of like how you receive knowledge. So I come from a lot of rules, but with the work that I'm doing now, I broke every rule that I learned before. I had to unlearn a lot of things to do what I'm doing right now. So in terms of my rules in these paintings, it's kind of it's a second nature that comes from all that foundation of knowledge and breaking some rules. So it's kind of a moment like of balance that happened between the rules that I know and the rules that I broke to get here.
Is there one rule that stands out to you that was difficult for you to break, like something that was comfortable or something that you relied on or looked forward to in a painting that you stepped away from and it felt significant to you?
Oh God, I mean,
It's a
I
difficult
think the one rule I broke then, and it kind of caused a stir. It was my first show in Baghdad in an art gallery that sadly was bombed and no longer exists. I was 21 and I created all these paintings of my old style that I don't know if I have some examples in my house, but they were sculpted from a material that looked like leather that I developed. And although I'm not using this, because everybody went against it, then some artists started copying it because it was very rewarding in terms of the three-dimensional result that I wanted from it. But I feel like I am still doing that, but with paint. So the one that was a rule that I broke in terms of the academy then, but also it led into what I'm doing right now, which is these moments of sculpting liquid. So I'm interested in that, and I think it's more gratifying and rewarding for me personally. It's for my nature, is to sculpt the painting from a negative space. So that's the one thing I can't overlook, right? I mean, I can't stop doing right now. And, obviously you can't paint with acrylic over oil.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, that's,
Can we can we talk about this painting verdict, because it feels like it feels like a totally different space than the others in some ways. It's not symmetrical in any way, but it does kind of have compartments, maybe more than like figures or forms that are that dual world or dual realm. This feels like a totally different idea of space. I wonder how you arrived at it, or what the problem was that you were solving as you worked through this.
Are we talking about the reason why I did that painting or the problem solving in terms of technique? Because they're both, and I'm happy to answer that.
I'm interested in both, but I love the blue seam, like that feels like a really interesting move. Yeah, in relationship to other works.
Thank you. Well, this is an older work from 2019 that was done for KMAC Triennial, and it was a reaction of basically my sister being denied her asylum case, and the judge basically told her, since you're not dead, you could go back to Iraq. And that led to some very visceral and triggering situation within me, obviously. And we're still dealing with this issue, TMI, but I want people to know about why this painting was painting, and it's that incident. And I feel like at that moment, I just wanted to document that. And, I was thinking about, obviously there are figures here. There is kind of an illusion of a British judge. And I was thinking about the history of the invasion of Britain to Iraq, which people then thought of it as great news versus the Ottomans who ruled Iraq. And I was just thinking of that colonial history as well. But also I was trying to decipher the human psyche, and there is a face, and the face doesn't have skin. And then it went into this whole kind of like deep dive into the technique where, it became like, where do I stop? Where do I actually give you a form or an idea about what's happening here? But also, where do I go with the color? So this one specifically, that blue, had actually the most layers possible because I wanted to create that. You see a gradient also from light to dark and dark to light. And just wanted to kind of highlight the certain areas within the painting. And then there is like that very ominous bird shape that was borrowed from actually Egyptian, not Mesopotamian in that case, because their association with that historical long story. So that's what's happening. But that was a painting that I had more freedom and zero fear to approach. And I didn't want to stop painting it, but it had to stop at some point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, difference here feels like a really it feels like a difficult composition to start with, and then like thinking about real kind of the darkness of that figure in the right, and the void. Like I'm just, this is, I guess, a painter's painting to me, or I really respond to it of just how many problems it seems you set out for yourself and then really resolved in an interesting way. And going back to it, I love your use of this kind of like undisclosed specific thing that you do, where it's like you have this very real story that you're using to create a world that is at times representational, but I don't even want to use that term because that's something I do want to ask you about, which is in a lot of writing, in a lot of interviews that I've read of yours, there's been a lot of conversation about starting as a representational artist and becoming an abstract painter. And I think I know the answer just from everything else we've talked about, or I have an idea of it. But do you view representation and abstraction as a binary? Where are you at within that?
I think I'm against labels I know you have to start somewhere, you have to group the artist in certain way and like an art history and the language around the work. Definitely I'm abstracting, but also, there are still forms and it's a gestural work. I like to keep the possibilities open because you don't know where, I don't know where I'm going to be in 10 years. I have a vision, of course, but I don't like to limit myself. And I know where the foundation of this work came from, which is a lot of realism and surrealism and, obsession with Impressionist and German painters, that basically use the figures. So I like the conversation to be open-ended about this, but also I see where it comes from. For now, maybe it's called abstraction. I feel like this is not for me to decide also. It's like
Yeah.
whatever the trend to call this work, I just don't want to label it per se. But I'm not offended if somebody else decides this is how they view the work. Does that answer?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it feels like, could I be wrong that it's an interest in the enigmatic, and like the enigmatic is maybe fixating on one thing. Like I think of like I remember being struck by like in Nabokov's Ben Sinister in the introduction, he talks about how the whole book is an ode or a motif to a tear-shaped puddle that he saw, and it's like I don't get that in the book itself, but I understand the point of an anchor that the artist needs to generate something enigmatic. And I feel like that maybe that's another way of saying what you said, which is maintaining an open system is politically important, personally important, to not be defined and to have a sense and a control over borders rather than being limited by them.
Yeah, I agree. And the foundation of my work is in the life I lived in Baghdad, where the figure started, the ambiguous figure. It's very esoteric and kind of there was a lot of obsession with so many topics for me then when I was younger. And all this kind of feed into the work. It's like you're having this many rivers feed into one big river. And this is how I approach my work and how I think about it. But also I am fascinated by the possibility of where it could go if I have more labor, if I have more physical ability and, a different situation in terms of space and time, because I do like to experiment with sculpture as well and other projects. So I like to keep it open, but also I don't mind reading into it because it's so interesting with what other people see. It's I'm not one of these artists where it's like, okay, this is my idea and this is how it's going to be. I'm the opposite. I'm very kind of welcoming of feedback, and by the word feedback is like, what are you seeing? What are you experiencing? What do you want to know? Where do you want to dive? There are no limitation for me. But also I approach this exhibition specifically from that whole idea of the bird's eye, where when you are flying over a place, when you're seeing a topography or a continent, things are abstract. But when you're coming closer, like the title painting, Sky from Below, actually has figures. It's a moment where I'm seeing from above, I'm seeing from below, obviously. And, if you think about when you're landing into a place, everything start exposing itself. What you couldn't see from above as a tree, you could see it as a tree, as an object. And this is how my work is approached in my head right now.
I love that. Above and below and inside outside. And going back to the kilographic and the use of the words, or the kind of almost Derrida sense of the utterance, or palimpsest, which is such an important metaphor throughout the work. What can be transmitted through the misunderstood word or the mistranslated word or the word that is no longer barely there, like a deeper, maybe mystic. I mean, not to get too woo-woo, but like, what do you think about like a type of, these could functions as a type of mystic vision, or like an image that you need to look at long and slowly see forms and kind of unravel in that way? Or are these very grounded and imminent in your way of thinking about them?
I think about them in the latter way, in the way where it is slowly unraveling to you, and you could feel whatever you want, all the feels from it, but also in the end, it will ground you in some way, or it will repel you. It will make you think in a certain way. And for me, that was the quest. That was how I lived my life. And I'm a very hopeful person in the end, and I'd like that work still to kind of eradicate some energy of like survival, because in the end, this recent body of work, it's dealing with a lot of our relationships with nature, which is, I feel like most of the artists are talking about that right now. It's like our way to go inward and just not think directly of the world, but if you think about history, there was always horrendous things happening. There was always wars and deaths, but we just didn't have internet, and we didn't have press, and we didn't know about them. So that cycle is happening in the work as well, and the cycle of life and death, and the cycle of despair and hope, and all these things. So I'm, very aware of that, and I like viewers to experience it in this way, but also they arrive somewhere, hopefully within, and some people it's not for them. It's something that is very difficult to approach, and that's fine too.
Yeah. Well, Vian, I've loved our conversation. I hope it's the first of many, and we have more conversation to come. I really enjoy your practice. I encourage everyone here to go and see the show while it's still up. You can't miss it. And I want to give time to everyone who has questions for you, because I'm sure there are a lot. But Vian, thank you so much for your time and for
Thank you, Andrew. Fascinating questions. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Vian and Andrew. We have so many questions. We'll try to get to as many as possible. First question is from Tyrini. You referenced multiple mythology: Sumerian, Babylonian, Persian. Could you speak to how you combine this into works?
Thank you, Tarini. I lost some of your voice, Min, so I'm gonna try to answer what I understood is, I think I basically just, is that I always talk about this, the collective consciousness moment happened when I combine all these kind of references, because I do believe all these cultures are connected and have like a common ground with certain metaphors and certain references. And I try to, sometimes these references come out organically, and sometimes I do actually dig deep into research about some of these kind of backgrounds. So that's how I approach them. I don't know if that answers the question.
Amazing. Thank you. The second question is from Craig Stockwell. The first point Andrew raised was about borders. I'm curious about your actual making of the painting borders. It appears to me that they're a final finishing move, last thing painted. Can you describe your process and the decision-making involved?
Yeah, that's a great question. The borders start when I apply the oils, the solid areas. And sometimes those, when I described my initial processes, the beginning with all the kind of more abstract scenes and those areas that kind of interacting, and I lead them through a process of manipulation on the canvas. But when all these moments settled, that's when the borders becomes, with the solid areas, and they could be following the series theme, or the decisions happen also based on what I was thinking about in that specific moment or for that specific series. But that's the last kind of phase of the process, but it could last for a couple of months, sometimes 3, sometimes 4, depend on the scale of the work. But they're always the moments that is when I'm using the brush and I'm using the oil.
Third question is from GE. As much as your expression is rooted in your experience as an exile, exploring themes of identity and displacement, is it also a search for belonging?
Yes, definitely. It's like an everlasting attempt to belong somewhere, and but also not fully kind of disconnect from my background, because with many artists, actually, even artists who were born, for example, here, I noticed that you get to a point where you don't fully belong in a certain place. When you experience migration, in my case right now, I know if I was living in Iraq right now, I will not feel that I fully belong, because I've been living here for 15 years, and I had to really work on belonging to this place. So I feel like I'm in this ever kind of lasting kind of quest to create that balance between my background and where I am right now. Thank you. I saw that.
Next question is from Gabby. Are the paintings more like a landscape seen from a person's point of view on the ground rather than topographical?
They're both. And that's where I sometimes really fail to describe, because for me, it's like that moment where it's like this, it's you're looking from above, and then by the time you're observed into the painting, you're facing what you're seeing. But you can go back to that topographical moment where you're looking from above. But also for this show specifically, I think it manifests because I've been thinking a lot about how that moment when you are looking at something above you, but also you could be in the same moment looking from below, actually above and below, and how you approach a space and arrive to a space and things start clearing and becoming more defined. So for me, it's both always. These are tough questions, but I love it.
Our last question is from an anonymous member of the audience. What do you use to make textures outside brushes?
To create texture outside of the brushes, knives, glass, plastic, hands, brooms, anything that lead eventually into an archival moment, because I'm so boring in how I talk about that. I am obsessed with archiving this work. So I use all these tools, but also I use, the moments that I create with the solid areas has to be brushes. They're very specific brushes. It has to be brushes that create certain precision. But before that, I use everything. And I use, sometimes like metal tools to scrape. And, I'm happy to share these things because it's not a secret. But the process to create that is what requires from me like a lot of time. It took me 25 years to learn how to add certain pigments and strip them in a crevice that was left from a color previously, and then scrape over that and creating a highlight of that color. Just to be very, honest about that process.
We actually have one more question. Our last question is from Laura Waddington. Thank you so much for the fascinating conversation. What comes across in the way that you talk about your work is that you have such an interesting and independent trajectory. Your background in mathematics, AI, and your interest in architecture, ancient Mesopotamia, and then the political side, including the very powerful approach to and background of Verdict. Your experience you briefly mentioned in Associated Press, your refusal to be a victim and a resistance to labels. Have you thought about writing in parallel to your visual art practice if you don't already?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Laura. I actually wrote a lot about my work that I didn't publish, and I don't know if I have enough time to write more about it. That would be something that I'd love to do, because I feel sometimes even on conversations like this, I go too abstract in the conversation. And then I remember things that I should have seen, explained or mentioned. So it's a great way, I think, is to have the time to write about that. And definitely I intend to do more of it. But I also, going back to the first part of your question or statement, is I am interested in creating more physical spaces with my work, which means I'm interested in taking the paintings into more of a sculptural or three-dimensional experiences, immersive kind of installations in the future. So hopefully I could get to that in the near future.
Exciting to hear. Thank you so much, Vian and Andrew. Thank you, Gabriella from David Nolan Gallery, for their support in preparing for today's event. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSE program and making these daily conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rail's YouTube channel. The Rail has been free and independent for 24 years. A donation directly supports our writers, production staff, and operations. You can support our work through the link in the chat. And join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation on the Paris-based reading series Double Change. And as it is a Rail tradition, you can now turn on your microphone and say goodbye as you leave. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you
Bye,
Thank you
everyone.
so much for the
Good.
conversation.
Bye.
Bye.
Great. Thank you.
Amazing
Bye.
conversation.
Thanks.
Yeah.